The dust-laden wind howled across the barren plains of New Mexico territory as Lillian Davenport clutched her horse's reins, her vision blurring as fever ravaged her body. The year was 1876, and what had begun as a journey of hope westward had deteriorated into a desperate fight for survival. Her knuckles whitened as another wave of dizziness struck her, the vast, unforgiving landscape seeming to tilt and sway beneath her mount. Lillian had left Philadelphia 3 weeks prior, fleeing the scandal of a broken engagement and seeking a new beginning as a schoolteacher in Santa Rosa. The position had promised dignity and independence qualities she desperately craved after her fiancé had revealed himself as nothing more than a fortune hunter targeting her family's dwindling assets. What little money she possessed had been spent on the journey west, with barely enough remaining to establish herself once she arrived. Now, as the afternoon sun beat mercilessly upon her bonnet, Lillian feared she would never see Santa Rosa at all. The fever had started 2 days ago, a slight warming of her skin that she dismissed as merely the desert heat. By this morning, her throat burned raw, her limbs ached as though she'd been trampled by horses, and her chest felt constricted with every labored breath. "Just a little further," she whispered to her horse, a gentle mare named Penny who had been her only companion for much of the journey. "We must reach town before—" Her words faded as consciousness slipped away. Lillian barely registered the sensation of sliding sideways from the saddle, the ground rushing up to meet her as darkness enveloped her world. Yards Steele was not a man who believed in fate. 8 years of driving cattle across the harshest territories of the American frontier had taught him that survival depended on preparation and grit, not divine intervention. Yet something had compelled him to take the northern trail back to Santa Rosa rather than his usual route, and that decision placed him directly in the path of the unconscious woman lying in the dust. He reined his stallion to a halt, dusty boots hitting the ground before the animal had fully stopped. The woman was young, mid-20s, perhaps her complexion flushed unnaturally against the pallor beneath. Her traveling clothes were fine but practical, the fabric quality speaking of Eastern origins. "Miss," he called, crouching beside her. When she didn't respond, Yards pressed his calloused palm to her forehead and swore under his breath. She was burning up. Quickly assessing the situation, he noted her horse standing nervously nearby, its reins trailing. A leather traveling case was secured behind the saddle, suggesting she had been heading somewhere with purpose, not merely wandering lost. Santa Rosa lay another 15 miles ahead, much too far in her condition. "Looks like you're coming home with me," he muttered, gathering her slight form into his arms. She weighed hardly anything, her body radiating heat through the layers of her clothing. As he lifted her, she stirred slightly, eyelids fluttering to reveal fever-bright blue eyes that struggled to focus on his face. "Who?" she managed, her voice barely audible. "Yards Steele, madam. I've got a place about 3 miles from here, going to get you somewhere safe." She tried to protest, her hand weakly pushing against his chest before another wave of fever seemed to claim her consciousness. Yards settled her carefully on his horse, mounting behind her and securing her limp form against his chest with one arm while holding the reins with his free hand. With a click of his tongue, he urged the horse forward, leading the woman's mare alongside them. The 3 miles to his modest ranch stretched longer than usual with the burden of the sick woman in his arms. Yards had built his spread over 5 years of backbreaking work, transforming a dilapidated homestead into a small but profitable cattle operation. It wasn't much compared to the grand ranches further south, but it was his, paid for with sweat and determination after years of working for others. By the time the weathered cabin came into view, nestled against a stand of cottonwoods beside a small creek, the woman was shivering violently despite the afternoon heat. Yards dismounted carefully, lifting her once more into his arms before shouldering open the door to his home. The interior was simple but clean: one main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. A small adjacent room served as his kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was the first real home he'd known since leaving his family's failed farm in Missouri at 16. Yards placed the woman on his bed, quickly building a fire despite the season. Her shivering concerned him, the fluctuation between chills and fever suggesting an infection of some kind. Once the flames caught, he fetched water from the creek, setting a pot to boil while he searched for the small collection of medicines he kept for emergencies. As the water heated, he returned to her side, awkwardly considering what to do next. Her traveling clothes were dusty and unsuitable for someone ill, but Yards hesitated at the impropriety of removing a strange woman's garments. Finally, practicality won out. He would have to make her more comfortable if she was to fight off whatever illness had claimed her. With careful movements, he removed her boots and outer garments, leaving her in her chemise and petticoat. He covered her quickly with his cleanest blanket, placing a cool cloth on her forehead. Throughout the process, she remained mostly unconscious, occasionally murmuring incoherent words or names he didn't recognize. "You'll be all right, miss," he said, not knowing if she could hear him. "Just need to break that fever." As night fell, Yards prepared a simple tea from willow bark, something his mother had sworn by for fevers. He managed to rouse the woman enough to swallow a few sips before she lapsed back into restless sleep. Setting himself up in a chair beside the bed, he prepared for a long night of vigilance. Lillian drifted through landscapes of fever dreams, occasionally surfacing to a reality that seemed equally disorienting. She was vaguely aware of being in an unfamiliar place, of rough but gentle hands tending to her, of a deep voice speaking reassurances she couldn't quite comprehend. When consciousness finally returned more fully, weak morning light was filtering through a small window beside the bed. She blinked slowly, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The room was rustic but neat, log walls adorned with a few practical items, a fireplace with dying embers, and a table where a broad-shouldered man sat with his back to her. Panic flared briefly before memory returned the trail, her illness, strong arms lifting her. She tried to speak, but her throat produced only a dry rasp that nonetheless caught the man's attention. He turned quickly, revealing a weather-tanned face with striking gray eyes beneath dark brows. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with the lean, muscular build of someone who worked physically demanding days. "You're awake," he said, his voice carrying the slight drawl of someone raised further south. He crossed to her side, offering a cup of water. "Small sips now." Lillian accepted the water gratefully, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. "Thank you," she managed after a moment. "You're Mr. Steele," he nodded. "Yards Steele, found you collapsed on the trail yesterday. You've been fighting quite a fever." "Lillian Davenport," she replied, struggling to sit upright before his hand gently pressed her shoulder back to the bed. "Best not try that just yet, Miss Davenport. Fever's down some, but you're still weak as a newborn foal." Embarrassment flooded her as she became more aware of her situation alone in a stranger's home, wearing only her undergarments beneath the blanket. Her cheeks flushed, and Mr. Steele seemed to read her thoughts. "Your things are right here," he said, gesturing to her neatly folded clothing on a nearby chair. "I, had to make you more comfortable to treat the fever. Your case is there too, nothing's been disturbed." "I appreciate your help," Lillian said, forcing propriety to overcome her discomfort. "I was traveling to Santa Rosa. I'm to be the new school teacher there." Yards raised an eyebrow. "Santa Rosa's expecting you when?" "The school term begins in 2 weeks. I was arriving early to establish lodgings and prepare," he nodded. "School board will be relieved." Old Miss Winters retired sudden like last spring. They've been sharing teaching duties among those who can read well enough. He paused. "You were traveling alone?" The question carried no judgment, merely concern, but Lillian still felt defensive. "I had little choice. My circumstances required." Immediate relocation. Something in his expression suggested he understood leaving places in haste. "Well, you're welcome here until you're strong enough to continue. Santa Rosa's just a half-day's ride once you're well." "I couldn't impose. It's no imposition." "Can't very well send you off in your condition." He stood, moving toward the small adjacent kitchen. "Think you could manage some broth, made some while you were sleeping." Lillian's instinct was to refuse. She'd already taken too much from this stranger, but her body's needs overruled her pride. "That would be most welcome, thank you." The next few days established a careful routine. Yards tended his ranch during daylight hours, checking on Lillian frequently. He slept on a bedroll near the fireplace, insisting she keep the bed until her strength returned. The fever lingered, though less severely than that first night, and Lillian found herself sleeping through much of each day. By the third morning, she was able to sit up and take proper meals, simple fare that nonetheless revealed Yards to be a competent cook. He explained he'd learned out of necessity during his years as a trail hand before establishing his own place. "Most cowboys can manage beans and coffee," he told her as she sat wrapped in a blanket at his table, "but after years of that, a man either learns to cook something better or loses his mind." "And how long have you had your ranch?" she asked, finding herself genuinely curious about this quiet, competent man who had likely saved her life. "Going on 5 years now. Started with 20 head of cattle in this run-down cabin, up to nearly 100 head now." There was understated pride in his voice. "Not the biggest spread, but it's mine free and clear." "That's impressive," Lillian said sincerely. Building something from nothing, Yards shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing what needed doing." He stood, collecting their empty bowls. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," she admitted, "though still rather weak. Fever like that takes a lot out of a person. Give yourself time." Later that afternoon, Lillian insisted on at least washing her own clothing, unable to remain completely idle despite her lingering weakness. Yards provided a wash basin and soap, setting it up on the small porch where she could sit in the fresh air while working. As she laboriously scrubbed her travel-worn garments, she observed him mending a fence in the nearby corral. He worked with the efficiency of someone who had long ago learned that wasted motion meant wasted energy. His movements were deliberate, his focus complete. Occasionally, he would look up, catching her watching him, and a faint smile would cross his features before he returned to his task. That evening, feeling somewhat restored by the fresh air and activity, Lillian asked more about Santa Rosa. "It's growing," Yards told her as they sat before the fire. "Railroads talking about putting a line through next year, about 400 people now, mostly decent folk. Got a proper church, general store, school of course. Even got a doctor last year, young fellow from back east looking to establish himself where he's needed. And the children, what can I expect from my students? Mixture, like anywhere. Ranch kids, townspeople's children. Some Mexican families who have been here generations. About 30 school-age children altogether, I'd guess. Do many continue their education beyond the basics?" Lillian asked, her professional interest engaged. Yards considered this. "Some do. Blacksmith's son went east to university last year first from Santa Rosa to do so. Most learn what they need to work the family business or ranch, though. Well, perhaps I can inspire a few more to consider broader horizons," she said with more animation than she'd shown since falling ill. Yards studied her for a moment. "You care about teaching, it's not just work for you." "Education transformed my life," Lillian admitted. "My father was a professor before his death. He believed women deserved the same quality of education as men and ensured I received one. I hope to pass that gift onward." "Noble cause," Yards said, his tone sincere rather than condescending. "Santa Rosa's fortunate to have you." The compliment warmed her more than seemed reasonable, and Lillian found herself studying her hands to avoid his gaze. "If I can get there in suitable condition to teach, I'm fortunate you found me when you did, Mr. Steele." "Yards," he corrected gently. "Mr. Steele was my father." "Then you must call me Lillian," she replied. "After all, propriety seems rather beside the point after you've nursed me through fever." His lips quirked in a half-smile. "Fair enough, Lillian." By the 5th day, Lillian was strong enough to move about the cabin freely, though still prone to fatigue. She insisted on contributing to the household tasks, preparing meals when Yards was occupied with ranch work and organizing the modest living space. She discovered a small collection of books on a shelf: history, a volume of poetry by Whitman, and practical guides to ranching and animal husbandry. "You read Whitman?" she asked that evening, genuinely surprised to find the progressive poet's work in a cowboy's cabin. Yards looked almost embarrassed. "Trade with a passenger on a cattle drive years back. He was heading to San Francisco, had a trunk full of books." Gave me that one when I expressed interest, he paused. Like how he sees the world, the dignity in ordinary work and common folk. Lillian regarded him with new interest. You're not what I expected from a cowboy, Yards Steele. And what did you expect? He asked, a hint of challenge in his tone. She considered the question honestly. Someone rougher, less, thoughtful. 8 years on cattle drives gives a man plenty of time to think, he said simply, and to learn which parts of roughness are useful and which are just for show. That night, as Lillian lay in Yard's bed listening to his steady breathing from his place near the fire, she found herself contemplating the strange circumstances that had brought her here. If she hadn't fallen ill, she would already be in Santa Rosa, establishing herself in whatever accommodations the school board had arranged, preparing for her new position. Instead, she was recuperating in the home of a cowboy who quoted poetry and made willow bark tea for fevers. More confusing were the feelings beginning to stir within her a warmth when he entered the room, a pleasure in their conversations that extended beyond mere gratitude for his care. Such sentiments were foolish, she knew. Once recovered, she would continue to Santa Rosa and begin her new life as planned. Yards Steele had his ranch and his life. Their paths had crossed only through misfortune, yet as sleep claimed her, Lillian found herself hoping the crossing of paths might not be so temporary after all. The following morning brought a visitor, the first since Lillian's arrival. Yards was checking cattle in his north pasture when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Lillian to the window. A man in his 50s, with a sun-weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, rode up to the cabin and dismounted with the ease of someone who had spent decades in the saddle. Uncertain of the protocol, Lillian wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. "Good morning," she called. The man stopped short, surprise evident in his expression. "Morning, madam," he replied, removing his hat. "Didn't expect to find a lady at Yard's place. I'm Frank Hollister, neighbor from about 5 miles west." "Lillian Davenport," she replied. "Mr. Steele is checking his herd but should return shortly. Would you care to wait?" Frank studied her with undisguised curiosity. "Don't mind if I do." As he approached the porch, he added, "Forgive my surprise, madam. Yards keeps to himself mostly. Not one for visitors, especially the female kind." The comment sparked questions Lillian hadn't considered. Had there been women in Yard's life before? The absence of feminine touches in the cabin suggested not, at least not recently. Before she could formulate an appropriately polite response, Yards himself appeared, riding in from the pasture. "Frank," he greeted, dismounting. "Everything all right. Just passing through, thought I'd stop by," Frank replied, his gaze darting meaningfully between Yards and Lillian. "Seems you've been busy while I've been gone." Yards' expression remained neutral. "Miss Davenport fell ill on her way to Santa Rosa. Found her collapsed on the trail about a week back. She's recovering here until strong enough to continue her journey." Frank's expression shifted from speculation to concern. "My apologies for jumping to conclusions, Miss Davenport. Fever's nothing to trifle with out here. Your fortunate Yards found you." "I'm well aware of that, Mr. Hollister," Lillian replied graciously. The men discussed local matters, water rights, cattle prices, a wolf pack that had been troubling livestock while Lillian excused herself to prepare coffee. When she returned with 3 steaming cups, Frank was recounting news from his recent trip to Las Vegas, New Mexico. "Word is the railroad survey team will be through next month," he was saying. "If they approve the route through Santa Rosa, land values will jump overnight. Good for the town," Yards commented, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks to Lillian. "Good for anyone holding land nearby, too," Frank pointed out. "Including you. Ever thought about selling this place? With railroad money flowing, you could get 5 times what it's worth now." Yards shook his head firmly. "Not interested. Built this place myself, not giving it up for any price." Frank shrugged. "Your choice. Speaking of choices, town's having a harvest dance next Saturday, first one since the drought broke. You ought to come, both of you." His eyes twinkled as he glanced at Lillian. "Would be a fine way to introduce our new school teacher to Santa Rosa society, such as it is." Lillian brightened at the mention of the town gathering while Yards looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Don't much care for dances," he muttered. "Nonsense," Frank countered. You just don't care for feeling obliged to socialize. Different thing entirely. He turned to Lillian. Been trying to get this hermit to participate in town affairs for years. Maybe you'll have better luck persuading him. After Frank departed, a silence hung between them as Yards busied himself with ranch chores, and Lillian returned to the household tasks she'd assigned herself. The mention of her eventual departure for Santa Rosa had cast a shadow over the comfortable routine they'd established. Yards seemed particularly withdrawn, responding to her attempts at conversation with short, distracted answers. By evening, Lillian's patience had worn thin. As they sat eating supper, she set down her fork with deliberate care. "Have I offended you somehow, Yards?" He looked up, genuinely startled. "Course not. Why would you think that? You've barely spoken 10 words since Mr. Hollister left. If my presence has become burdensome, it's not that," he interrupted, then sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Frank has a way of stirring things up, making me think about things I'd rather not." "Such as?" Yards hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Been on my own a long while, got used to it. Then suddenly there's someone else here and it's not unpleasant, makes a man wonder about choices he's made." The admission hung in the air between them, fraught with implications neither seemed ready to address directly. Lillian found herself studying the weathered hands that had cared for her so gently during her illness. "I've wondered if perhaps I was too hasty in accepting the position in Santa Rosa," she admitted quietly. "If perhaps there might be other possibilities." Their eyes met across the table, and something electric passed between them, recognition of mutual attraction tempered by the practical realities of their separate lives. "Santa Rosa needs a teacher," Yards said finally. "You've trained for it, have a gift for it from what I can tell." "Yes," Lillian agreed, "but Santa Rosa is only 15 miles away, not an insurmountable distance." A cautious hope flickered in his eyes. "No, not insurmountable at all." The next morning, Lillian awoke feeling stronger than she had since falling ill. The fever had fully broken, and while she remained somewhat weaker than normal, she recognized her recovery was progressing well. The acknowledgement brought mixed emotions, relief at her returning health, yet apprehension about what it meant for her temporary residence with Yards. She found him outside, chopping wood despite the early hour. The rhythmic swing of the axe emphasized the strength in his shoulders and arms, and Lillian allowed herself a moment to simply observe him unnoticed. There was something profoundly attractive about his self-sufficiency, his quiet competence in all things. When he paused to wipe his brow, she stepped forward. "I believe I'm well enough to travel to Santa Rosa soon," she announced, the words tasting bittersweet on her tongue. "Perhaps tomorrow or the next day." Yards set the axe down, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "No need to rush if you're not fully recovered. I shouldn't impose on your hospitality indefinitely. It's no imposition." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see flecks of darker gray in his eyes. "But I understand you're eager to begin your new position." "Not eager to leave," Lillian corrected softly, "simply aware that I must eventually." Something shifted in his expression, resolution replacing uncertainty. "Come to town with me today," he said suddenly. "Need supplies anyway. You can see Santa Rosa, make arrangements for your lodgings, then come back here until you're fully recovered." The suggestion offered a perfect compromise, a step toward her inevitable departure without forcing an immediate separation. "I'd like that very much." 2 hours later, they were traveling toward Santa Rosa in Yards' wagon, Lillian's mare tethered behind. The journey was pleasant, the early September air carrying just a hint of autumn's approach. Yards pointed out landmarks as they traveled, a butte with a distinctive shape, a creek that ran year-round even in drought years, the distant mountains that marked the territory's eastern boundary. As they crested a final rise, Santa Rosa appeared in the valley below a collection of adobe and wooden buildings nestled alongside the Pecos River. It was larger than Lillian had envisioned from Yards' description, with several streets radiating from a central plaza. A church spire rose prominently, and she could make out a schoolhouse set slightly apart from the main cluster of buildings. "It's lovely," she said, genuinely impressed by the settlement's picturesque setting. "Growing fast," Yards commented. was half this size when I first came through 8 years back. They entered town at a leisurely pace, Yards acknowledging greetings from various townspeople with nods or brief words. Their curious glances at Lillian were not lost on her, and she maintained her most proper posture despite the lingering weakness from her illness. Their first stop was the Mercantile, a large establishment fronting the main street. As they entered, the proprietor, a balding man with spectacles, looked up from his ledger. "Yards Steele twice in 1 month. Must be some kind of record," he called good-naturedly. His gaze shifted to Lillian with undisguised interest. "And who might this lady be?" "Samuel, meet Miss Lillian Davenport," Yards replied. "The new schoolteacher. Miss Davenport, Samuel Jenkins runs the finest mercantile between Santa Fe and Texas." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Davenport," Samuel said, coming around the counter to shake her hand. "Town's been waiting on you. School board was getting worried when you didn't arrive as scheduled." "I fell ill on the journey," Lillian explained. "Mr. Steele found me and has been kind enough to assist in my recovery." Samuel's eyebrows rose slightly, but he merely nodded. "Fortunate indeed." "You'll want to see Howard Prescott. He heads the school board. Office is just down the street, next to the Land Title Company." After Yards completed his purchases, coffee, flour, ammunition, and a few other necessities, they made their way to Prescott's office. The school board chairman was a thin, fastidious man who expressed both relief at Lillian's arrival and concern over her illness. "We were beginning to fear the worst, Miss Davenport," he admitted. "Letters can go astray, but when the stage arrived without you—" He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "However, all's well that ends well. The schoolhouse is prepared, though your living quarters still require some attention." "My living quarters?" Lillian inquired. "Yes, the schoolmistress traditionally occupies rooms at the rear of the schoolhouse. I'm afraid they've been used for storage since Miss Winters departed. We'll need a few days to make them habitable." Yards, who had remained silent during the exchange, spoke up. "Miss Davenport is still recovering her strength. She's welcome to remain at my ranch until her quarters are ready." Prescott looked between them, poorly concealing his surprise. "That's most generous, Mr. Steele, though perhaps Mrs. Whittaker could offer accommodation. Propriety, you understand." Lillian felt a flash of indignation at the implied impropriety. "Mr. Steele has been a perfect gentleman during my illness, Mr. Prescott. I assure you my reputation remains intact." Of course," Prescott backpedaled quickly. "I meant no offense. It's just that in small communities, appearances are often given more weight than reality," Yards interrupted, his tone deceptively mild. "Miss Davenport will make her own decision regarding accommodations." The rest of the meeting proceeded more smoothly, with Prescott outlining Lillian's duties and the school calendar. The term would begin in 10 days, giving her ample time to prepare both herself and the classroom. As they left the office, Lillian noticed Yards' tense posture. "You're angry," she observed quietly as they walked back toward the Mercantile. "Don't care for people making assumptions," he replied, "especially when they touch on a lady's reputation." "It was predictable," Lillian sighed. "A single woman staying with a bachelor, there will be talk." "Shouldn't be. Nothing improper happened. The world rarely concerns itself with facts when gossip is more entertaining." She touched his arm lightly, "But I appreciate your defense." Their next stop was the schoolhouse, where Lillian was introduced to the building that would become the center of her professional life. It was a simple structure with large windows to admit light, rows of desks, a blackboard, and a modest collection of books. The living quarters at the rear consisted of 2 small rooms, a bedroom, and a combined kitchen/sitting area. As Prescott had warned, these spaces were currently filled with stored furniture and supplies. "It will be lovely once cleared," Lillian declared optimistically, mentally arranging the rooms with her few possessions. They completed their tour of Santa Rosa with lunch at the town's small restaurant, where Lillian met several more community members, including the young Dr. Frank had mentioned Dr. Thomas Walsh, who insisted on briefly examining her to ensure her recovery was progressing appropriately. "The fever's passed," he confirmed after checking her pulse and temperature, "but you'll need another week of rest before resuming full activities." Yards has done an admirable job with your care." By mid-afternoon, they were heading back to the ranch, Lillian thoughtful as she processed all she had learned about her new community. "They seem like good people," she said eventually, "though I suspect some will continue to raise eyebrows about my temporary living arrangement." Yards kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "You could stay with Mrs. Whittaker if you'd prefer, avoid the talk, and miss these last few days of peace before beginning my duties." Lillian shook her head. "I'm not so concerned with gossip as that." A smile tugged at his lips. "Glad to hear it." That evening, after a simple supper, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the landscape in brilliant oranges and golds. The day's activities had tired Lillian more than she'd expected, reminding her that her recovery was still incomplete. "It truly is beautiful here," she said, gesturing toward the vista before them. "So different from Philadelphia. Can't imagine living in a city," Yards admitted. "Too many people, too little sky." "There are advantages: libraries, theaters, museums," Lillian replied. "But I find I don't miss them as much as I expected to." She glanced at him. "Perhaps because I've found unexpected compensations." Their eyes met, and Yards' expression softened. Slowly, he reached across the space between their chairs, his hand covering hers. The touch was simple, yet more intimate than anything they had shared during her illness. "Been thinking about what you said yesterday," he said quietly. "About Santa Rosa being only 15 miles away." Lillian's heart quickened. "Yes, wouldn't be difficult to make that ride, regular-like." He hesitated, clearly navigating unfamiliar emotional territory. "If there was reason to." "I believe there could be very good reason," she replied, turning her hand beneath his so their palms met, fingers intertwining naturally. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, neither rushing to define what was developing between them. For now, it was enough to acknowledge possibilities, to recognize that what had begun as an act of rescue might be evolving into something far more significant. The next few days established a new rhythm to their interactions, a growing ease with casual touches, lingering glances, and conversations that stretched into the night. Yards showed Lillian more of his ranch, proudly pointing out improvements he'd made and sharing plans for expansion. In turn, she spoke of her teaching philosophies and hopes for her students. 3 days after their visit to Santa Rosa, a wagon arrived bearing Mrs. Whittaker, a plump, energetic widow in her 50s, and her teenage son, along with supplies to prepare Lillian's quarters at the schoolhouse. "School board sent us to help get your rooms ready, Miss Davenport," Mrs. Whittaker explained after introductions were made, "and to bring you to town, of course. Can't have our new teacher arriving for term still recovering from illness in a bachelor's cabin, can we?" Tongues are wagging enough already. The blunt statement hung awkwardly in the air until Yards spoke. "Miss Davenport is welcome here until she's fully recovered, Mrs. Whittaker. Doctor's orders." Mrs. Whittaker assessed the situation with shrewd eyes. "I see. Well, the rooms won't be ready for another 2 days at least. Perhaps by then you'll be feeling stronger, Miss Davenport." She paused meaningfully. "Though I must say, you look remarkably well for someone supposedly too weak to relocate." Lillian felt herself blush but maintained her composure. "Mr. Steele has been most attentive to my recovery. I'm fortunate he found me when he did." "Indeed," Mrs. Whittaker replied, her tone suggesting she was drawing her own conclusions about the nature of that fortune. "Well, shall we discuss what you'll need for your quarters?" "I've brought fabric samples for curtains." For the next hour, the women discussed practical matters of setting up Lillian's new home, while Yards and young Robert Whittaker repaired a loose board on the porch. When the Whittakers finally departed, with arrangements made to complete the quarters in 2 days' time, Yards and Lillian stood watching the wagon disappear down the trail. "She means well," Lillian said diplomatically. Yards snorted. "She means to manage everyone's business, always has. She did make it clear I'm expected to move to town immediately." "That what you want?" Lillian turned to face him. "What I want and what's necessary aren't always aligned. I need to establish myself as the schoolteacher, earn the community's respect. That becomes more difficult if I'm perceived as improper." Yards nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression despite his disappointment. 2 days, then. 2 days, she agreed softly, though perhaps not our last. That evening, as stars emerged in the clear sky, Yards suggested a short ride to show Lillian his favorite spot on the property. Though still being careful with her recovery, she felt strong enough for the excursion and eagerly agreed. They rode at a leisurely pace, Lillian on her mare and Yards on his stallion, until they reached a small rise overlooking a bend in the creek where cottonwoods created a natural grove. Dismounting, Yards spread a blanket on the ground. "Best view of the sunset from here," he explained, offering his hand to help Lillian down from her horse. They sat side by side as the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the landscape in fiery hues. The beauty of the moment seemed to intensify Lillian's awareness of the man beside her, his steady presence, the faint scent of leather and soap that she had come to associate with him, the warmth of his shoulder against hers. "When I first came west," Yards said quietly, breaking the companionable silence, "moments like this made the hardships worthwhile, all the dust and blood and backbreaking work. Then you'd see a sunset like this and remember why you stayed." "It is magnificent," Lillian agreed. "Different from eastern sunsets, bigger somehow, more." She gestured expansively. "Untamed," he supplied. "Yes, exactly." She turned to look at him, finding his eyes already on her. "I never expected to find beauty like this," or she hesitated, "or," he prompted gently. "Or someone like you," she finished, summoning her courage. "Someone who would not only save my life but make me question what I want that life to contain." Yards shifted to face her more directly. "And what do you want it to contain, Lillian?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities. Lillian considered her answer carefully, aware they stood at a crossroads of sorts. "Purpose," she said finally, "meaning, connection." She met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps love, if I'm fortunate enough to find it." "Think you might have found some of that already," Yards said, his voice dropping to a near whisper as one hand came up to gently touch her cheek. The moment stretched between them, taut with anticipation, before Lillian closed the remaining distance and pressed her lips to his. The kiss began tentatively, a careful exploration that quickly deepened as Yards' arms encircled her, drawing her closer. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft against hers, his embrace secure without being confining. When they finally separated, both somewhat breathless, Yards rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that since you first sat up and called me Mr. Steele," he admitted with a rueful smile. Lillian laughed softly. "I believe I started thinking about it shortly thereafter, though I was hardly in a condition to act on such thoughts." "You are now," he pointed out, brushing a strand of hair from her face with tender care. "Indeed I am," she agreed, leaning in to kiss him again with newfound confidence. They remained at the overlook until twilight deepened into true darkness, talking intermittently between kisses and comfortable silences. Yards spoke of his years driving cattle, of saving every dollar toward his dream of his own land. Lillian shared more about her life in Philadelphia, her father's progressive beliefs, her mother's early death, the scandal of her broken engagement that had precipitated her journey west. "He claimed to love me," she said of her former fiancé, "but when my father's investments failed after his death, leaving me with little inheritance, Edward's ardor cooled remarkably quickly." Yard's arm tightened around her shoulders. "His loss," he said simply. "Man who values money over a woman like you doesn't deserve either." The ride back to the cabin was quiet, both absorbed in thoughts of what had transpired between them and what might follow. As they reached the homestead, Yards helped Lillian dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "2 days isn't much time," he said, reluctance evident in his tone. "For what?" she asked, though she suspected she knew his meaning. "For figuring out what happens next, between us." Lillian placed her hands on his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath her palm. "I believe what happens next is that I move to town and begin teaching, as planned." She saw disappointment flash across his features before she continued. "And you ride into town regularly to court me properly, so that when the time comes to make more permanent arrangements, no one can claim we acted improperly." His expression brightened considerably. "Court you properly, that what you want?" "It is," she confirmed. I want to do my job well, earn the community's respect, and I want. She took a deep breath. I want to see if what's growing between us can flourish under normal circumstances, not just the unusual situation that brought us together. Yards considered this, then nodded. Makes sense. Though I'll miss having you here. And I'll miss being here, she admitted. But 15 miles isn't so far, as someone recently pointed out to me. The following day brought preparations for Lillian's departure. She organized her belongings. Now supplemented by a few items Yards had purchased for her in town: a warm shawl, a new journal, and a small bottle of rose-scented toilet water that had made her blush with pleasure when he somewhat awkwardly presented it. They spent the evening on the porch again, Lillian in her now customary chair with Yards seated on the steps beside her, his shoulder leaning against her knees. The physical contact between them had become more natural since their sunset interlude, touches and caresses interspersed through their conversation without self-consciousness. "Will you come to the harvest dance?" Lillian asked, her fingers absently combing through his dark hair. "Mr. Hollister seemed quite determined to see you there." Yards tilted his head to look up at her. "Not much for dancing." "Perhaps I could persuade you," she suggested, trailing a finger along his jawline. "I'm told I'm quite an accomplished dancer." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "For you, I might consider it." "Good," she said with satisfaction. "It would be a fine opportunity to begin our courtship publicly." The word courtship brought a slow smile to his face. "Never properly courted anyone before." "No." Lillian was surprised. "A handsome, established rancher like yourself must have had opportunities." Yards shrugged, a hint of embarrassment in his expression. "Been focused on building the ranch. Besides, most women want town life, not the isolation out here." He glanced up at her. "What about you? Can a Philadelphia lady be happy this far from civilization?" It was a question Lillian had been considering herself. "I believe happiness depends more on who you're with than where you are," she said thoughtfully. "And I've found Philadelphia society holds less appeal than I once thought." "That's so?" Yards rose to sit beside her, his arm slipping naturally around her waist. "Indeed, I find I prefer direct speech to veiled implications, honest work to idle pursuits, and," she smiled, leaning into him, "certain cowboys to city gentlemen." "Certain cowboys." He repeated, eyebrow raised. "Should I be concerned about competition? Only one cowboy has carried me home when I was too ill to stand," she murmured, tilting her face up toward his. "Only one has nursed me back to health with such care." Yard's expression softened as he bent to kiss her, a gentle meeting of lips that conveyed affection more than passion. "Only one plans to keep doing so," he whispered against her mouth, "for as long as you'll let him." The morning of Lillian's departure arrived clear and cool, with a crispness to the air that hinted at autumn's approach. Yards loaded her trunk and valise onto his wagon while Lillian made one last inspection of the cabin that had been her sanctuary during recovery. She had come to love the simple space with its handcrafted furniture and practical arrangements, evidence everywhere of Yards' self-sufficiency and attention to detail. "Ready?" he asked, appearing in the doorway. Lillian nodded, though her heart felt unexpectedly heavy. "It seems strange to be leaving. I've only been here a short time yet. Yet it feels longer," he finished for her, crossing to take her hands in his. "You've made a place for yourself here, Lillian, one that will remain even when you're in town." The simple statement eased some of her melancholy. This wasn't an ending, but a transition, a necessary step toward building something more permanent between them. The journey to Santa Rosa passed quickly, filled with conversation about the approaching school term and Yards' plans for his cattle as winter approached. As they entered town, Lillian was conscious of curious glances from townspeople they passed, aware that their arrival together would fuel existing speculation. Mrs. Whittaker was waiting at the schoolhouse, clearly having been watching for them. "Miss Davenport, right on time." "And Mr. Steele, how good of you to bring our teacher to town." Her tone suggested it would have been better had someone else performed this service, but Yards merely tipped his hat politely. The rooms behind the schoolhouse had been transformed during Lillian's absence. Floors were swept, furniture arranged, curtains hung at the windows. Though small, the space was clean and welcoming, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and basic kitchen furnishings. "It's perfect," Lillian declared, genuinely pleased with the arrangements. "Thank you for all your work, Mrs. Whitaker." "Happy to help, dear. Now, shall I help you unpack while Mr. Steele sees to the wagon?" The suggestion was clearly meant to separate them, but Yards spoke before Lillian could respond. "Need to speak with Miss Davenport privately before I go, if you don't mind, Mrs. Whitaker." The older woman's eyebrows rose dramatically. "Well, that is, just for a moment," Lillian added smoothly. "Mr. Steele has been kind enough to invite me to the harvest dance, and we need to arrange details." This information seemed to simultaneously surprise and satisfy Mrs. Whitaker. "The harvest dance? Well, that's lovely. I'll just wait outside then." Once alone, Yards pulled Lillian into a swift embrace. "Didn't want to leave without saying a proper goodbye," he murmured against her hair. Lillian held him tightly, breathing in his familiar scent. "When will I see you again?" "Day after tomorrow," he promised. "Need to check a section of fence, but then I'll ride in. Bring you some of those wildflowers you liked by the creek." "I'd like that," she whispered, lifting her face for his kiss. The kiss was brief but tender, a promise rather than a farewell. When they separated, Yards touched her cheek gently. "You'll do well here, Lillian. These people will come to respect you as much as I do." "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for everything, for finding me, caring for me. For falling in love with you," he added quietly, the words simple but profound. Lillian's breath caught. Though the sentiment had been implied in various ways, neither had spoken it so directly. "Yes," she managed, "for that most of all." One final kiss, and then he was gone, leaving Lillian to begin establishing her new life in Santa Rosa. As Mrs. Whitaker returned, already chattering about introducing her to various community members, Lillian squared her shoulders and prepared to meet her future, a future she now hoped would include both her teaching career and the quietly remarkable cowboy who had saved her life in more ways than one. The next weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Lillian threw herself into preparing for her students, organizing curriculum and familiarizing herself with the available teaching materials. The school board had provided the basics: readers, arithmetic texts, slates, but she supplemented these with her own books and teaching aids brought from Philadelphia. True to his word, Yards rode into town every few days. Their courtship proceeded with a proper formality in public chaperoned walks, shared meals at the restaurant, attendance at Sunday services, while private moments allowed for more intimate conversations and increasingly passionate embraces. The harvest dance proved a turning point in their relationship's public perception. Yards arrived in town early that Saturday, wearing a crisp white shirt beneath his best vest, his dark hair neatly trimmed. The transformation from working rancher to gentleman caller drew appreciative glances from the ladies of Santa Rosa and knowing smiles from the men. Lillian, who had splurged on fabric for a new dress of deep blue that complemented her eyes, felt her heart quicken at the sight of him waiting on the schoolhouse steps. "You look very handsome," she said by way of greeting. "And you're beautiful," he replied, his admiring gaze leaving no doubt of his sincerity. "Most beautiful woman in the territory." The dance was held in the town hall, decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty. Music came from a small band of local musicians, a fiddler, a guitarist, and an elderly man with a harmonica. The entire community seemed to be in attendance, from infants in their mothers' arms to silver-haired elders seated along the walls. Despite his earlier reluctance, Yards proved himself a capable dancer, guiding Lillian confidently through waltzes and reels. During a lively Virginia reel, she caught Mrs. Whitaker watching them with a thoughtful expression that had replaced her earlier disapproval. "I believe you're winning them over," Lillian murmured as they promenaded down the center of the formation. Yards squeezed her hand. "Only care about winning you. You accomplished that some time ago," she admitted, cheeks flushing with more than exertion. Later, as they stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, Yards led her away from the other couples seeking respite from the warm hall. In the shadow of a large oak, he drew her into his arms. "Been thinking," he said quietly. "About the future." Lillian's pulse quickened. "What about it?" "School term ends in June, By then, you'll have fulfilled your contract, established yourself here." His gray eyes searched hers in the dim light. "Thought maybe by then you might consider a change of residence. Are you asking me to marry you, Yards Steele?" Lillian whispered, hardly daring to believe this was happening now, beneath the stars with music floating from the hall. "Doing my best to," he replied with a nervous laugh. "Not very good at speeches. Just know I love you, want to build a life with you. Make improvements to the house, maybe add rooms as needed, for a family eventually if you want that." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes as joy welled within her. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it. I love you, Yards. Have since you carried me home and nursed me back to health." His kiss was tender at first, then deepened with passion and promise. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Yards pressed his forehead to hers. "June seems mighty far away." "It does," she agreed, "but we have weekends, holidays, time to plan our life together." They returned to the dance with new light in their eyes, their shared secret lending a special radiance to their movements. By evening's end, however, their happiness was evident enough that Frank Hollister approached with a knowing grin. "Don't need to ask what that smile's about," he said to Yards. "About time you settled down, son." Turning to Lillian, he added, "You're getting a good man, Miss Davenport, one of the best." "I'm well aware," she replied, slipping her arm through Yards. "I consider myself fortunate beyond measure." Word of their engagement spread quickly through Santa Rosa. To Lillian's relief, the reaction was largely positive. Her dedication to her students had already earned community respect, while Yards' established position as a successful rancher made him a desirable match in most eyes, even Mrs. Whitaker eventually offered congratulations, though she couldn't resist adding that a proper courtship would traditionally last longer. "Life on the frontier often accelerates such matters," Lillian replied diplomatically. "When one finds certainty, there seems little reason to delay." The months that followed took on a pleasant rhythm. Lillian threw herself into teaching, finding genuine satisfaction in her students' progress. Many showed remarkable aptitude once given proper attention and encouragement. She introduced Innovations nature study excursions, a small library corner where students could borrow books, and Friday afternoon debates for the older children. Yards rode into town twice weekly without fail, regardless of weather or ranch demands. He became a familiar figure at school events, often helping with repairs or improvements to the building. On weekends, Lillian would sometimes accompany him back to the ranch, chaperoned by Mrs. Whitaker's teenage daughter, to help with planning the expansions they envisioned for their future home. By spring, construction had begun on additions to Yards' cabin: a larger kitchen, a proper parlor, and a second bedroom. "For visitors," he explained when Lillian questioned the need, though his meaningful glance suggested he was thinking of future children rather than guests. As June approached, bringing the end of the school term and their planned wedding, Lillian found herself reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Had she not fallen ill on that dusty trail, had Yards not chosen the northern route that day, their paths might never have crossed. The thought was sobering. "Do you believe in destiny?" she asked one evening as they sat on his porch, watching the sunset in what had become their tradition. Yards considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Never used to. Always figured life was what you made it, nothing more, but then—" He looked at her, love evident in his expression. "Then I found you half dead on that trail and everything changed. Makes a man wonder." "Indeed it does," Lillian agreed softly. "I've never been one for mystical thinking, but the circumstances that brought us together seem almost designed." "Don't much care if it was chance or fate," Yards said, taking her hand. "Just grateful it happened." Their wedding took place on the first Saturday after the school term ended, a perfect June day with clear skies and gentle breezes. The ceremony was held in Santa Rosa's church, filled to capacity with townspeople, neighboring ranchers, and even a few of Lillian's former students who had traveled specifically for the occasion. Lillian wore a gown of ivory silk, ordered from Chicago months earlier, with a crown of wildflowers in her dark hair rather than a traditional veil. Yards, standing at the altar in a new suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, watched her approach with such undisguised adoration that several women in the congregation were seen to dab at their eyes. The vows were simple but heartfelt, promises of love and loyalty exchanged with clear voices and steady hands. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Yard's kiss was both tender and possessive, drawing good-natured cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration continued at the town hall, transformed with flowers and ribbons for the occasion. There was dancing, abundant food prepared by the ladies of Santa Rosa, and toasts to the couple's health and happiness. As evening approached, Yards whispered in Lillian's ear, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Steele." Her new name sent a thrill through her. "Yes," she replied simply. "I'm ready to go home." They departed amid a shower of rice and well wishes, driving Yard's wagon toward the ranch that would now be their shared home. The additions were complete, the rooms furnished with a mixture of Yard's original pieces and new items they had selected together. As they approached, the setting sun gilded the landscape in the same golden light that had been present the day Yards had found her. He drew the wagon to a halt before the front steps, then turned to her with a smile. "Seems fitting," he said, climbing down and coming around to her side. "What does?" Lillian asked, placing her hands on his shoulders as he reached up for her. Instead of setting her on the ground, Yards gathered her into his arms, carrying her toward the door just as he had that first day. "Carrying you across the threshold," he explained, "just like I carried you home when you were too sick to stand." Lillian wrapped her arms around his neck, emotion tightening her throat. "You saved my life," she whispered. "And you gave meaning to mine," he replied, pushing open the door and carrying her into their home not as a sick stranger but as his beloved wife. Inside, everything was ready for their arrival: a fire laid in the hearth against the evening coolness, flowers on the table, fresh linens on their bed. Yards set Lillian gently on her feet but kept his arms around her waist, reluctant to break contact. "Welcome home, Mrs. Steele," he murmured, bending to kiss her with newfound freedom, no longer constrained by propriety or the presence of others. Lillian returned his kiss with equal fervor, all the love and desire that had grown between them finding expression in the intimate moment. When they finally parted, both breathless, she smiled up at him. "It feels right being here with you, like I've finally found where I belong." "You belong with me," Yards said simply. "Always will." The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Lillian continued teaching for another term before their first child, a son they named James, after Yard's father arrived the following spring. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, her dark hair and serious expression reminiscent of her mother. The ranch prospered under Yard's careful management, expanding to include better breeding stock and eventually additional acreage when Frank Hollister decided to retire and sell his neighboring property. Lillian kept a small classroom in their home, teaching their children and occasionally those of neighboring ranchers too distant from town for regular attendance. Santa Rosa grew as predicted when the railroad arrived, bringing new opportunities and connections to distant markets. Yards served briefly on the town council, his pragmatic approach and fair-mindedness making him a respected voice in community affairs, though he always preferred the quiet of the ranch to town politics. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, Yards surprised Lillian with a journey not back east as she might have expected, but to the exact spot on the trail where he had found her unconscious that fateful day. "Why here?" she asked, puzzled by his choice of commemoration. Yards dismounted, helping her down from her horse. "Wanted to remind myself how close I came to missing you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If I'd taken my usual route that day, if you'd fallen ill a day later or earlier." Lillian placed her hand on his cheek, now bearing lines of weather and laughter that had only deepened his handsome features. "But you didn't. You were here exactly when I needed you most. Best decision I ever made," he said, drawing her close, "taking that northern trail." "And the second best?" she asked, smiling up at him. "Carrying you home," he replied without hesitation, beginning everything that followed. As they stood together on the spot where their story had begun, surrounded by the beauty of the land they both now called home, Lillian reflected on the remarkable journey from that moment of desperate illness to the rich, fulfilling life they had built together. From the brink of death to the fullness of love, from stranger to beloved, a journey that had begun with a simple act of compassion when she was too sick to stand, and a cowboy had carried her home.